In this video, I do a very intricate analysis of Mona Lisa. And I'm doing this because I don't really understand what's the big hype about this painting. I'm just going to give you my real time reaction to this thing as I look closely at it. And hopefully, we come up with something interesting. Consider it something like a reaction video, but for art. Okay, so as far as I know, what people make a big deal out of here is the fact that she has a mysterious smile. This is not a smile that really means much to me. When I look at the Mona Lisa, I don't really see a particularly beautiful person. I see a woman. She's got a iconic face, but the eyes look kind of weird, and she's got no eyebrows. All right, but let me try to attach somewhere else first, because I think I've never really looked closely at the background. So instead of looking at the person, I'm going to look at the background. And in the background, I see a bunch of things that we could think about symbolically. Now, I don't really understand anything about Italian geography, so I can't really trace these things back to whatever they might have been for Da Vinci. There seems to be a road. Now, this road might represent life. Often roads represent life. And you see the terrain, it's dusky, it's hilly, it's not inviting. I'd say it's not fertile. It's a dry landscape. All right, so that idea of fertility is interesting because I think we're meant to think of Mona Lisa as a very fertile figure. She certainly looks like a woman who's supposed to represent fertility. You can see the little bit of cleavage that she's showing off. She's a larger person, a larger woman, so I think there's a sense that she is bountiful. And that smile is inviting. If it's supposed to be at all seductive, then that plays into the fertility thing. So then why do we have this awfully dry landscape? Okay, there's a dry landscape and a fertile person. Perhaps that's centering the fertility of humanity over and above the disappointing dryness of the natural world. Let's read it that way. What if this is an attempt to foreground the human being over the landscape, above the landscape? Okay, so I like it that way. We know that Da Vinci was a humanist or something like that. I think humanism was a thing in the Renaissance era. So it would make sense that he presents humanity as being interesting and being full of life, and the natural world is not providing the same sort of promise. All right. So just looking at the left side of the background, these mountains, oh, could the mountains also be symbols of? No, I think I'm going to read them as dry. These mountains are disappointing landscape figures that curl towards the Mona Lisa. And Mona Lisa herself should represent then not just humanity, but an escape from the landscape. Okay, so maybe we come to her and leave wilderness, leave that myth of the pastoral behind. And what we have instead is this figure, this woman. Okay, so maybe declining Mother Earth, we instead take on Mother Mona Lisa. All right, that gives me some pathway into understanding her as a symbol of maybe fertility, of divinity, of the, well, not divinity, but the exaltation and elevation of the human being. But let me, before getting to her, look at the other things in the landscape. I see a bridge in the background. It looks like a bridge over the river, but the river again does not look particularly lively. It comes from this ocean in the background that again does not look particularly lively. It might be a lake, it might be a sea, I don't know what it is. There's some indistinct figures in the background. Maybe those are mountains, right? It's just a very dry landscape. And even the blues that are being used, the blues and the greens that are being used, I I I, I don't think they give way to a lush landscape. And I keep on saying landscape because that's all I see here. And we have a dry landscape. We have this bridge. All right, the bridge kind of looks like a Roman aqueduct, so I guess it's in Italy. That bridge obviously represents human ingenuity. Maybe it's explicitly trying to be classical or Roman, but of course the Roman Empire is gone, is dead, is long past. So perhaps antiquity, like the landscape, is being left behind. they're all kind of transmuting into one. And indeed, it's not apparent when you first look at this painting that you're seeing in the background a piece of man-made artifice in addition to the landscape. So it's all blending into one. Antiquity and nature are both a unity, and they're being shuffled away, truly made small by the natural dictations of foreground and background that Mona Lisa participates in. I mean, so we literally have something here like life, represented by Mona Lisa, shining forth over and above the landscape behind her. This is a very dusky picture, so there seems to be an interplay here between light and dark. If you notice, the brightest part of the entire painting is Mona Lisa's skin. I don't think we'd call it exactly white, but it's certainly whiter than what's behind her, than the canyons, than her clothing. Let's think about her clothing. If her clothing is dark, I think part of the reason why it's dark is to emphasize the brightness and lightness and whiteness of her skin. But of course, that darkness also, in a broad way, connects the clothing to the landscape behind her. So perhaps clothing, while adorned by the human, gets to be in the foreground, but ultimately nothing is more important. Nothing shines forth as brightly and as supremely beautifully as her skin, as the body of the woman, the human itself, stripped of all adornments. How do you describe her hair? It looks like her hair is a little bit red. There's not quite red throughout the rest of the painting. Maybe the canyons a little bit, but you see, especially on her right, the right side of her face, there's this real red there. Of course, red is passion. Red is blood. It seems to be, I don't know, like right at the intersection of the landscape and her face. I don't know if I can make anything out of that, but red is an important color, of course. Let's see. What about her pose? What can we say about her pose? She's relaxed. I'd say she has these arms and these hands that kind of drape over the chair she's sitting in the same way that her clothing drapes over her. There's this kind of lusciousness about her, which adds to the idea that Mona Lisa represents fertility, that she's kind of like a symbol of life. So I think that if Leonardo is speaking about the importance of the human, he's also arguing that the human being expresses life through emotion, through a sensuousness that's apparent in the way that the body shapes itself, the way the body kind of dances. Now, of course, he's butting up against the problem of art, of painting, which is that it's non-motile. It's not film. Film hasn't been invented yet. But he still represents, I'd say, Mona Lisa. How does he arrive at that kind of mobility? Because she seems like she's moving to me. She's moving, but she's relaxed, as if there's a kind of beautiful dynamism inherent in the human figure. The curves, for instance, that shawl, that dress, that scarf that's over her left shoulder, it's like a waterfall, right? It's a waterfall, and I think there's also a waterfall somewhere in the back there, and it curves kind of like the curve of the road. So I think Da Vinci uses that shape to create that sense of motion. It's very impressive. Yeah, I suppose you could say that the road actually continues from the background through Mona Lisa. The curve kind of continues through her hair, and then definitely through that shawl over her left shoulder. Which means that there's something of a compositional unity here established between background and foreground, between landscape and subject. The human is at one. It's united with its environment. I think this is an ideal of Renaissance humanism more generally, right? That the person is the center of the world, which does not mean that they're the only thing in the world, but rather that they exist in lovely harmony with that world. So, I think you could even say that there's something about the colors that is not that distinguishable between the subject, the women, and that which sits behind her. It's a picture in which the background yields to the woman, allowing the human subject to hold possession of some of its attributes, but ultimately being subjugated to her. It's really interesting. And one thing that allows us to do is sort of read Mona Lisa as a kind of natural object, right? We can see her hair as like the trees in the background. We can see her skin as like the land in the background. Of course, rhyming with traditional figurations of Earth as a mother, as a woman. And again, once we can see her shape, the curves, the feminine curves, kind of natural feminine curves, as a different expression of the curves of the landscape, right? And that's one of the things that I think we should emphasize here. Different expressions of the same idea, expressed one way through the land and another way through the human being. What can the human being do? Well, one thing they can do is present a different sort of flavor to the ideas that might already be present by nature. Traditionally in Western thought, we think of nature as a book, right? The book of nature. Its author is God. And of course, we also see mankind as a kind of text that God has written, that God has imprinted something on. One way to read DNA is as a series of different textual imprints, nucleotides that can be read as a book and that are expressed in phenotype that's centralized here. Why is the Mona Lisa sitting? I think it's a question that's worth asking here. When you sit, how is that different than standing? I'd say that there's a bit more of a relaxed position. You are not in action, you are passive. And yet I think we would not do justice to Mona Lisa to call her passive, right? There is still an activity mixed with that sedentary pose, that sedentary repose. We know she's sitting because she's sitting on a chair. And I don't think we've given much thought yet to the chair, but it's evident from the chair that it's made of some sort of wood, as chairs tend to be. And wood is, of course, sourced from trees, right? So maybe we can actually see the chair as a kind of interesting part of this composition. That the chair is that which mediates between the human and nature, right? I guess I've been reading this painting as a commentary on the proper relationship between the human subject and their natural surroundings, right? But that's not just the strict binary that fits neatly into foreground, background. Rather, Mona Lisa and her natural environment play off of each other. And that chair is very important to this process. The chair is that which situates her in this particular circumstance, this particular natural environment, right? And of course, the chair is, again, made of the organic material of nature. Okay, so Mona Lisa sits upon an object that is a direct representation of that nature. But, importantly, what does the chair represent? And following from that question, what does it mean for Mona Lisa to sit on a chair? Well, the chair is, of course, handiwork, right? And I was just talking about how nature and a human being are both examples of text that God has written. But the chair is something that man has written, man has created, right? So if, on the one hand, the two primary things in this painting, the background and the subject, are creations of God, the thing which puts them together is distinctively a creation of mankind, right? It's a chair. It's a fashioning of the natural world for our purposes, for our utility. And a chair is not just any object, right? A chair is what we sit in to write. We sit in it for leisure, for rest. It is our escape from the world. It supports us. It is something that we make and that which serves us in the future, displaying our ability to use the natural world not just for our utility but for our comfort, right? And of course, one thing we can say about Mona Lisa is that she's definitely relaxed. I think Da Vinci is making a kind of commentary here on leisure, among many other things too. In this grand interplay of nature and the human, there's also just the question of leisure, right? How can somebody create art? Art, if you take history classes, right, one thing they emphasize about these ancient civilizations is that finally you have artisans. Finally, you have artists who might craft something for leisure, or for so-called leisure, for art's sake. Art for art's sake, but also art for the sake of human enjoyment, which is a necessary part of life. And I think the chair is a very good example of something that represents leisure, right? So the chair is human work, which propels the opposite of work, or the complement of work, not the opposite, right? And I think that complementary relationship is the grand idea of this painting, right? Man in perfect harmony with nature, right? This Mona Lisa, I keep on talking about man, right? But I think it's important that this painting, which has so captivated us, is a woman and not a man, because there's a gender difference there too. Why a woman and not a man, right? If it really is about humanity's relationship with nature, why make the representative of humanity a woman and not a man? Well, I think part of that is the natural interplay between the natural world. When I say a natural interplay, I mean the kind of usual, stereotypical, traditional interplay between the natural world and the feminine, right? The nature is the female, and labor, however misguided this association may have been, labor was associated with the masculine. So perhaps the feminine sits on the masculine work, and the feminine, lovely and beautiful, shows up as the representation of humanity, our best foot forward. And also, she's, I think we need to remark upon the little bit of cleavage that we see there, right? Her bosom is a symbol of fertility, right? The relationship between man and nature is one that is fertile, okay? I don't know if I've said something to the contrary during this talk, but I think that that background is not barren. It is full of all of the constituents that make good agriculture, right? Plant life, vegetation, soil, water. And again, we see that we see what agriculture supports. Human innovation, human creation, the chair, the aqueduct, or the bridge in the back. Okay? So ultimately, we come into harmony with nature in order to create things and be bountiful, be fruitful. Mona Lisa. There's something motherly about this gaze, right? Youthful, but also motherly. She seems to stand, sitting on a chair, by the way, a chair might also be a throne, right? Kings are always sitting. Kings are sitting and people kneel before them. Kings don't need to stand up in order to be elevated over people. They might retain the privilege of leisure. In a way, Mona Lisa sits atop nature as its champion, as its conqueror, but not as its malevolent conqueror, rather as a human being, a representative for all humankind, peaceably and wonderfully, in complement, in harmony, a word I use over and over, with nature. I think that's what we get here. That's why the colors all look the same, right? That's why this is such an earthy picture. And I think that's why it's compelling to us, because it's great balance, right? But it's also great vibrancy. There is life in spite of the balance. Sometimes we might think of people who are too perfectly balanced, who are too heavily routinized as not quite living. But I think here we have an example of, wonderfully equivalent weightedness between that which is wild and that which is reasoned, that which is sensible and that which is sensitive, right? I never really thought about the chair before. It's kind of majestic how that connects. And that's it. This is the most famous painting in Western culture. It's just a picture of a woman sitting. And I never really understood why it was such a big deal. But here now, reflecting for about 20 minutes, I think we were able to come to something. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be making more of these videos in the future. So if you want to see more of these organic analyses of artworks, subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.